Hello and welcome to the second part of our discussion about US-Russia relations as we continue to chart the developments following the Biden administration taking charge in the United States. We are very grateful that Dr. Dmitry Suslov has agreed to join us today to carry forward our last talk that happened right after the election of the new US administration last year. Dr. Suslov is the Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He is one of Russia's best known experts in the subject and is a prolific writer and commentator. Dr. Suslov, welcome to the discussion and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's my big pleasure.
So, my first question rather obviously relates to the New START Treaty, wherein its extension has been received with much relief across the world. But now that the extension has taken place, how do you see the future of US Russia bilateral dialogue on strategic stability? The US is already also looking at pursuing talks with China on this issue, and there has been also some talk of inclusion of the newer types of weapon systems in the discussions. So, how would you describe Russia's position on these issues, and how do you see the future of strategic stability talks panning out?
Well, first, I consider the extension of the New START Treaty to 5 more years as a very positive sign because it preserved the level of confidence and transparency which exists. And at least for now, we avoid uncontrollable arms race. We avoid even further increase of mistrust in the military aspects of US-Russian relations. And we avoid a further increase of the risk of war between Russia and the United States. So the last remaining component of arms control, the last remaining legal instruments to regulate our relations in the nuclear area is saved for the time. But you are absolutely right. The extension of the New START is not an end of US-Russian dialogue on strategic stability for the future and adaptation of arms control to the future, but just the beginning. The extension itself creates positive preconditions for US-Russian dialogue in this area because Biden administration and Democrats at large do not consider arms race and arms race blackmail as a preferable instrument of confrontational policy vis-a-vis Russia. Of course, the US policy towards Russia in general will remain adversarial and confrontational. And Joe Biden, in his first public speech on foreign policy, which he delivered in the State Department, called Russia adversary. And his rhetoric and his administration's rhetoric vis-a-vis Russia is even more hostile and adversarial than vis-a-vis China. But having said that, the strategic stability and arms control area is indeed among those which is kind of compartmentalized, which is decoupled from the general confrontational state of the relations. And both sides are interested to avoid a complete vacuum, a complete chaos, and complete absence of the rules of the game in strategic stability. So both sides are interested in creating a new architecture, a new system of regimes, agreements, understandings, that will adapt arms control for the existing and future challenges, and which will avoid both the risk of war and the risk of uncontrollable arms race for the future. These negotiations will not be difficult. These negotiations will be difficult, will not be easy. And I would not exclude that there could be no other treaty beyond the New START. So I strongly doubt that within several years from now, Russia and the United States would negotiate some sort of START 4. They would probably try to do it, but the chances, as for now, they remain relatively low. Why? Because already now the positions of the sides, the preferences of the sides strongly differ on what should come next. Biden administration had made it very clear already now that it wants for the new treaty, it wants to include all the types of nuclear weapons, which means including non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. Definitely, it wants to include the newest types of strategic delivery systems which Russia has developed and deployed, including the hypersonic ones. And thirdly, Biden administration wants to include China into the future arms control arrangement because China is considered as the major competitor, as adversary, and as a military adversary, not just general, but also as a military adversary for the United States. So staying limited by arms control arrangements and having the major competitor and the one of the major adversaries out, not limited by those regimes, is unacceptable for the United States. So quite remarkably, Biden administration puts the same conditions for future arms control arrangement, which Trump administration was putting for the extension of the New START, right? So the difference is that Trump linked extension or tried to link extension of the New START in 2020 with covering non-strategic nuclear weapons and inclusion of China. Biden agreed to extend the New START without these conditions, but these conditions are extremely important for the Biden administration for any future arrangement. Russian position is very much different. Russia, I strongly doubt that Russia would agree to include non-strategic nuclear weapons into the future arrangement if the future arrangement doesn't cover those areas in which the United States has advantage over Russia, which is, for instance, the conventional armaments, especially high precision conventional weapons. Including those non-strategic nuclear weapons where Russia has numerical advantage in general and in Europe, but failing to include other areas which impact strategic stability, such as high precision conventional weapons, would be a non-starter for Russia. Russia will simply disagree, right? And already now Russian officials claim that the issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons is off the table. Secondly, in terms of including other parties into arms control, Russia disagrees with including just China. From the Russian perspective, we should either preserve bilateral arrangement with the United States, or as an alternative, include all the official nuclear countries, which in addition to China include France and UK. But this is unacceptable for the United States. Also, the Russian position, which was already officially delivered to the United States, is that any future arms control arrangement must address all the areas which impact strategic stability. And from the Russian perspective, these areas which impact strategic stability include missile defense, high precision conventional weapons, weapons which could be deployed and might be deployed in the outer space by the United States targeted against Earth, and cyber weapons. So Russia claims that in order to go forward, these areas must be addressed, not just tactical nuclear weapons, but in the first place, these other areas and types of arms which impact strategic stability. So Russia offers some limitations, or would love to see some rules of the game and limitations here. But at the same time, the United States claims that this is so far unacceptable. And the United States is very reluctant to accept either limitations on arms control, or limitations on high precision conventional weapons, or limitations on or prohibition of deployment of weapons in outer space, and so on and so forth. So having said all that, the positions of the sides regarding the future arms control arrangement, even with the Biden administration, seem not just different, but opposite, simply opposite. And it would be extremely difficult to negotiate something which could be ratified, right? Do not remember do not forget, sorry, the United States remains strongly paralyzed. And Republicans will consider any compromise on the part of the Biden administration, any decision that would look softer than the position of the last Republican administration, which was the Trump administration, as a sign of weakness, betrayal of American national interests, and so on. So already now, American experts are telling us, and they're very sincere in this, and I agree, that without including, for instance, non-strategic nuclear weapons, or with some limitations on those areas which Russia insists much be limited, any future agreement will be simply unratifiable in the American Senate. This is why I really doubt that within the next 3 years, not 5 years, 3 years, because in 2024 there will be new presidential elections in the United States, and if we can achieve something to be ratified, it should be achieved at least by 2023 or early 2024. I strongly doubt that something could be elaborated by that time, provided all the differences and opposite positions. But nevertheless, the positive side is that neither Russia nor the United States nor the Biden administration wants to have uncontrollable arms race. So maybe instead of providing a legally binding agreement, a new classical type of legally binding agreement, the sides would negotiate, would have consultations, would negotiate on burning issues, on those areas where rules must be established, which are very dangerous in terms of provoking an inadvertent war, which could then escalate to the nuclear levels. And these include rules of the game in cyber area, not classical limitations, of course, but some types of rules of the game in cyber area. That really includes high precision conventional weapons. And this also includes INF, intermediate range land-based missiles, which are and will be in the future considered to be very destabilizing. And it's quite dangerous to have deployments of those missiles either in Europe or in Asia. So I assume that it would be possible still for Russia and the United States to discuss those separate issues, of course linked among each other, but still to discuss certain issues of arms control relations and strategic stability relations, and to have some at least regimes, understandings in those areas, or rules of the game in those areas. And when it comes to intermediate range missiles, then China also could be included into those negotiations. So some progress might happen, but not necessarily this progress would result into a new classical legally binding arms control treaty equivalent with the New START or START 1 or SALT treaties in the 1970s. And from my perspective, it would be much more prudent and much more effective if instead of negotiating a new classical treaty, Russia and the United States now would use these 3 years, which are before the next presidential elections in the United States, to discuss a completely new architecture, a completely new understanding of multilateral strategic stability, and would fill the vacuum in those gray areas, which are mostly dangerous in terms of inadvertent war.
Okay, so from what I understand is that despite the extension of the New START, the future negotiations on strategic stability will be very, very difficult. But you do believe that there is some scope that is there for talks, at least on this issue. But apart from strategic stability and arms control, what are the other possible areas of coordination? Because President Biden, in his remarks at the State Department on February 4th, said that his administration would not hesitate to raise costs on Russia, but also said that diplomatic engagement, even with adversaries, will continue. So, in your opinion, what will be the focus of the bilateral agenda based on your assessment of the Biden administration and how the US administration is looking at Russia? What will be the agenda?
You are absolutely right in your assumption that US-Russian relations under Biden administration will be bifurcated. And this bifurcation would include intensification of rivalry and confrontation in certain areas, but selective targeted cooperation in the other areas where sides have mutual interest. So on the one hand, the United States will and already is increasing its criticism of Russia on the issues of human rights and domestic politics. And we've just heard very strongly formulated demands on immediate release of Alexei Navalny, one of the leaders of the Russian protest, and so on and so forth, right? So very apparent American position on Russian domestic politics. Strongest support of the protesters, of the leaders of the Russian opposition, including Navalny. We will definitely see future sanctions from the United States related to those areas. And the US would also increase the containment of Russia at the post-Soviet space, in Europe, in the Middle East, and in many other places in the world. As I've already said, the Biden administration considers Russia as adversary, as both ideological and geopolitical adversary. Unlike Trump administration, which considered Russia mainly as a geopolitical adversary, Biden has already, repeated this democratic traditional mantra that Russia largely wants to weaken American democratic political system. So it is regarded as a danger against democracy, against the political system and values of the United States, and must be contained in this regard. So containment policy would increase, would intensify. And moreover, Biden administration would want and is already trying to engage allies and partners to conduct this containment policy. So unlike Trump's policy, Biden's policy of containment would be, or it will at least be supposed to be, a multilateral containment in close coordination with allies and partners of the United States, primarily in Europe. Which is even more tough and unwelcome, of course, for Russia than unilateral kind of containment conducted by Trump. But at the same time, indeed, in certain areas, the scope for cooperation, selective cooperation with Biden administration will be easier and bigger than with the Trump administration. And beyond the strategic stability and arms control area, which we already discussed, among those areas where Russia and the United States could and probably would cooperate in the future, I personally see management of the Iranian nuclear program, which is a priority for Biden administration, and it cannot be done without participation of Russia as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a party of the JCPOA, into which Biden administration would want to return in this or that form and under these or that conditions. Secondly, management of the North Korean nuclear program, which will also be a priority for a Biden administration. Thirdly, I think issues of climate change should be among the priorities of US-Russian cooperation, because both countries currently increase importance of climate change and ecological areas in their foreign policy agenda. For Biden administration, climate change is already proclaimed as one of the struggling against climate change is already proclaimed as one of the major areas, one of the major tools to reestablish, to revive American global leadership. What was a nuclear-free world for Barack Obama, his Prague agenda, is climate change for Biden, right? The channel through which Biden administration would want to kind of reestablish the image of the United States as a benevolent hegemon, as a producer of public goods, and responsible leader. And Russia is also increasing importance of climate change and ecology in general in Russian foreign policy. Vladimir Putin talked extensively about those areas in his recent speeches and addresses, including at the Valdai speech in autumn last year. And Russia and the United States have a region, a neighborhood region where they face each other, which is mostly impacted by the climate change. This is Arctic. And I think that cooperation on ecological and climate change issues in the Arctic is very important. First, because the pace of climate change in the Arctic exceeds the global pace of climate change in 2-3 times. And secondly, because climate change cooperation in the Arctic seems to be the only way to at least mitigate this spillover of confrontation into the Arctic, and Arctic becoming just another area of strong US-Russian confrontation, and US-China also confrontation. So if we don't cooperate on climate change in the Arctic will become one of the preferential regions of confrontation. And we will see further militarization, arms race in the Arctic, confrontational political rhetoric, and so on and so forth. Then struggle against the COVID-19 pandemic. Right, this is also without question a area of where Russia and the United States could cooperate, because that's a global challenge. And finally, this was already named as one of the Russian preferences: restoration of normal and healthy diplomatic and consular relations, which were very strongly hit in the times of the Trump administration. They started to be undermined in the last weeks of Obama, but then Trump administration exacerbated the problem with the closing downs of many consulates and diplomatical objects in Russia and the United States, which undermined the effectiveness of our diplomatic dialogue, which strongly undermines people-to-people contacts. Right now, it's very difficult for the Russian citizens, for instance, to get American visas. And this contradicts the general preference of the Biden administration to emphasize people-to-people contacts, to support the dialogue between civil societies. Right. So restoration of diplomatic and consular relations is at least a potential area of cooperation.
So I can see that you've highlighted several foreign policy issues on which US-Russia cooperation is possible. But what we have seen increasingly is Russia emerge in a lot of domestic issue debates in US politics. And even when President Biden had his telephone call with President Putin, the talk was about the SolarWinds hack, the allegations of bounties on US soldiers in Afghanistan, interference in the 2020 US elections. And Russia has also been accusing the United States of interfering in its domestic affairs, most recently in the case of the protests that have taken place after arrest of Alexei Navalny. So while one does expect this sort of trading of accusations to continue, what does it mean for the overall agenda setting for the bilateral relationship? And how much will these issues overshadow the foreign policy issues on which cooperation might be possible?
Well, the issues of domestic politics is one of the major contradictions and one of the major problems in US-Russian relations in today and in the future. And what you just mentioned prove that the relations will become adversarial. And these mutual accusations of interference into domestic affairs will be one of the major reasons for the further exacerbation, for the further increase of the US-Russian confrontation in general, worsening of the political climate, and the general adversarial paradigm of the relations. Just as I said, the overall paradigm of US-Russian relations will remain and will even increase to be adversarial. The countries regard each other as adversaries, both geopolitical and ideological. And they are kind of symmetric, unfortunately, in these perceptions. The US claims that Russia wants to weaken the United States globally and undermine American democratic political system. Russia also claims that the United States wants to weaken Russia globally, contain Russia in all the regions and all the domains possible, and to undermine Russian political system and to install some kind of colored revolution in Russia and overthrow Putin's regime. The apparent support for Alexei Navalny will, of course, strengthen those concerns. In Russia, and the overall adversarial approach towards the United States would strengthen and would remain to be dominant in Russia. It would not, though, prevent us from selectively cooperating with the United States, where this cooperation is in national interests of both countries. But this is kind of beyond the brackets of the overall adversarial and confrontational agenda. And unfortunately, domestic politics in both countries will remain, not just in Russia, but in the United States as well, will remain a negative factor for US-Russian relations. In Russia, it's obvious, right? The US support for which has become open and very insistent and very apparent, the US support of the Russian protests, opposition, Alexei Navalny, other oppositional leaders, the application of sanctions for the issues of domestic politics, wider and more intensive usage of Magnitsky Act as the foundation for future sanctions against Russia. That would all exacerbate the confrontation from the Russian side. But in the United States, unfortunately, the election of Joe Biden would not totally erase Russia from American domestic agenda. You know, one of the problems of US-Russian, one of the major problems of US-Russian relations under Trump administration was that Russia was one of the major issues of American domestic politics. It was the Russian factor was the major instrument in the hands of Democrats and traditional elites against Donald Trump. But the arrival of Joe Biden probably decreased, but not eliminated totally, the usage of Russia in American domestic politics. And Russia is still present in American domestic discourse because one of the ways for kind of overcoming the divide in the United States and one of the priorities of American domestic politics now is further marginalization of Trump supporters. And we've seen it very clearly after the siege of Capitol. You know, the Trump supporters were claimed as inner terrorists. Many of them are persecuted in the social media, fired from works, and so on and so forth. So there is a public condemnation campaign and public cancellation campaign when they are blocked, canceled, you know, in the social media and so on and so forth. And this will continue in the United States. This McCarthyism 2.0 will continue. And Russia is presented as an external ally and patron, as external supervisor and mastermind of those internal enemies, as a natural ally of Trumpists, right? And as the elites in the United States struggle against Trump supporters, they simultaneously struggle against Russia and present Russia as an inseparable, participant in all this in all these internal games, and that dooms the United States for adversarial policy, for depicting Russia as the ideological enemy, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, the Russian factor and discourse in the United States will also remain toxic.
You mentioned the Capitol Hill, the storming of the US Capitol, and that is actually my next question, where I want to ask you about the internal challenges that both US and Russia face, and how does that impact on the bilateral ties? So, apart from the US Capitol being stormed, which actually really highlighted the task before the US administration, the current Biden administration, to focus on issues that confront the nation, which include dealing with the pandemic, the economic development, issues of race, all of that together. And in addition to that, they will have the challenge of dealing with China, climate change, and all of those other foreign policy issues. And Russia also has its ongoing domestic issues. Uh, reg- First are the protests that are ongoing, the economic impact of the pandemic, the parliamentary elections are this year, and of course, everybody's still asking questions about what happens in 2024 in Russia as well. So, how much focus of the two sides will be on their relations with each other? Because the US Russia ties, they are not at the center of global affairs like they were during the Cold War era. So, what does all of this mean together when combined with a need to focus on domestic revival issues in both US and Russia?
Nivedita, unfortunately, I do not think that the weight and scale of these domestic and other foreign policy issues would not compel, I do not think that those domestic and foreign policy issues would distract Russia and the United States from each other. And would create preconditions for some improvement or normalization of relations. On the contrary, these domestic problems would result into further intensification of US-Russian rivalry, because this rivalry, both sides kind of, the leadership of both sides benefits in the current conditions from this rivalry, and uses this rivalry for their domestic purposes. In the United States, the major internal problem is the deep division of the country, both in terms of political elites and in terms of society, where two Americas coexist with different values, different economic base, and different visions of the future. And in conditions of this division, and in conditions of immense polarization of American political system, which is the result of this division, improvement of relations with Russia is simply impossible. Improvement of relations with Russia requires a bipartisan coalition in the United States. Today, the only bipartisan coalition which exists in the United States is in favor of confrontation with Russia, and also in favor of confrontation and containment of China. So containment of Russia and containment of China are the only things about which divided parts of American political elite agree, right? On all the rest, how to fight the pandemics, how to help the economy, what to do with migration, what to do with taxes, and so on, what to do with sexual minorities, they strongly disagree, right? Moreover, in conditions of such a big external division, in conditions of such big internal division, external enemy becomes very useful as a consolidating other. And we are viewing that very clearly in the United States. The claim by Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State and presidential candidate, that Trump links and relations with Putin must be investigated, is nothing but the attempt to use Russia as this external enemy for the purpose of internal consolidation, right? To present Russia as the reason behind Trump, as the reason, or at least a factor behind Trump and Trump supporters, right? Which makes it easier for the American elites to describe Trump supporters and Trump himself as internal enemies, right? Persecution of whom, struggle against whom would largely help to reunite the country. Right, so I always have claimed that internal problems of the United States, such intensive rivalry, political rivalry within the United States, is not beneficial for U.S.-Russian relations, because it compels the United States for even more adversarial policy vis-a-vis Russia. From the Russian perspective, and from the Russian domestic situation, also, the more the United States support Alexei Navalny and the protesters, the easier it is for the Kremlin to describe them as foreign agents, as the fifth column, which is coordinated and supported by the major adversary of Russia, by the United States, which is used to strengthen the legitimacy of the state. So internal problems and protests, internal divisions, political rivalry results to further intensification and continuation of the U.S.-Russian confrontation. You also mentioned China. Management of China, confronting China, containing China, will of course be among the major foreign policy priorities of the Biden administration, although they will slightly reshape the instruments of this confrontation, but the paradigm of American policy towards China definitely remains confrontational. And the necessity to confront China again does not bring the United States to improvement of relations with Russia. So the US is unlikely to repeat the opposites to what Henry Kissinger did in 1970s by establishing cooperative relations with Maoist China against the stronger at that time rival Soviet Union. For several reasons, they will not do that. First, American domestic politics does not allow this. Because, as I said, Russia is regarded as a both geopolitical and ideological rivalry. Secondly, the US consider Russia as a weaker country, as a declining partner. And by the way, one of the major problems of US-Russian relations is that we both consider each other to be declining. Which reduces the political incentives for dialogue, for engagement, and for some compromises. Why should you give concessions to the other side if you consider the other side declining and kind of weakening by itself? So the US considers Russia as a country in decline, which will inevitably, in their opinion, change internally, and in terms of foreign policy, you need just to wait. And to provide some more kind of incentives and pushes for Russia to accelerate this decline, including sanctions, containment, criticism, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, the US officialdom, and this is also an area of consensus in the United States, the US officialdom and political elite believe that by itself, Russia will inevitably clash with China. Thus, additional kind of compromises and incentives should not be provided by the United States. Why should you give some concessions to Russia in order to pull Russia away from China if you believe that in some years from now, sooner or later, the sides will clash inevitably among each other, because China is rising, Russia is not, because of the strengthening of asymmetry between them, and so on and so forth, right? Unfortunately, there's also this perception, which from the Russian perception is wrong, but still dooms the US for continuation of the policy and strategy of dual confrontation, dual simultaneous confrontation with China and with Russia.
So I understand that there is not a cause for much optimism in US-Russia relations. So in 2021, if you were to set the agenda for what these two countries should try to do, the very bare minimum, what would you suggest, say, to the foreign ministry officials in both countries, what they should be doing in just 1 year without damaging the relationship a bit? Maybe not very high expectations, but bare minimum. What can these two countries do in this year in terms of their bilateral agenda? Quick answer for that.
Well, my answer would not be very different from what I already described as opportunities for selective cooperation between Russia and the United States. First, they should manage confrontation. They should avoid uncontrollable, inadvertent war and uncontrollable escalation of any inadvertent conflict between Russia and the United States. They should establish and strengthen deconfliction measures along all the line and border where Russia face NATO and each other, where Russia, NATO, and Russia, US intersect. It's not just Syria, it's Black Sea region and Baltic Sea region. They should establish strong rules in the military aspects of cyber relations, and they should start discussing the new philosophy and the new architecture of strategic stability adapted to the future challenges and to the future environment where it is multilateral, multifaceted, including not just nuclear, but also other types of strategic weapons. They should at least begin those dialogue on strategic stability. At the same time, they should establish cooperation and dialogue on climate change in the Arctics and protection of ecology in the Arctics. They should multilaterally work on the re-establishment of the JCPOA and new attempt to manage the North Korean nuclear program. And they should re-establish normal diplomatic and consular relations and simplify people-to-people contacts between Russia and the United States.
We really hope that the two sides will actually look into these issues, and hopefully there will be some positive development on at least some of these issues. I see that we are nearing the end of our scheduled time for this interview. Dr. Dmitry Suslov, thank you so much for joining us and explaining in such meticulous detail the developments in US-Russia relations and their overall impact. Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you very much. It was a big honor and pleasure for me. I'm always at your disposal. Thank you.
Thank you.